Okay, welcome everybody. As folks come into the Zoom webinar room, I just want to lay out a couple of kind of admin things at the top. First thing is welcome. We're very happy to have you here. This is going to be a kind of run through of all of the top level features, benefits of different tools that we have for organizations that sit on top of the OSF. Many of these are paid products. Some of them are services that help with knowledge sharing, culture change at your organization or institution. Um, we will be sending out after this webinar a recording of the webinar as well as a recap of different resources that we've talked about in the webinar. So don't worry if you're not paying attention, there will be a recording and it will be available for you to peruse. We will be primarily talking about these products, so OSF institutions, registries, collections, and preprints, with a real focus on OSF institutions and OSF registries. I'll say that two of my amazing colleagues are here in the Zoom, and they will be answering questions for you. Primarily Gretchen Giggin, who's our member services manager, who is really an expert in library sciences, in metadata, much of which she assisted in building in terms of the new OSF data metadata schema. She can answer a lot of questions you might have. So please put all of those questions in the Q&A. We also have another member of our marketing team, the amazing Teresa, who is under the COS events webinar handle, but she's here to help answer some questions too, if you may have them. And I'll say that if you have questions about spinning up one of these services for your organization, you can email me, Nadia, at cos.io. If you are already here and from an existing member organization, so maybe you have an institution's membership, maybe you're coming from a organization that already has a collection or a registry or a preprint, Gretchen is the person to talk to. So you can email her directly at gretchen@cos.io if you have questions. And I'll just say that we're just going to do a really quick survey at the top. This is really for me to understand whether or not you are familiar with the OSF. Just take a moment to answer these questions as I continue chatting. And they're really just about, again, your familiarity with the OSF. Have you ever made an OSF account? And if you're familiar with OSF institutions in particular. If you have questions about the various OSF paid products that I'm talking about or services, you can go to cos.io/tools. Or you can Google it. If you want more information just on the OSF, which is free for individual users, including yourselves at all times, you can find that information as well on the Center for Open Science's website. And if you want to make a free OSF account today, if you don't already have one, you can do that on osf.io, and you can do that in just a couple of minutes. You can also link it with your ORCID ID, or if you're from an affiliated university, you can log in using single sign-on from that university. So recommend, as I'm talking, to do that so you can kind of click around and play around as I'm chatting here. And if you want, we always invite and love for you to introduce yourself in the chat, say where you're coming from, what you're interested in learning a little bit more about, and let us know if you have any specific questions in the Q&A so that Gretchen and Teresa can keep track of them. Okay, so let's start big picture first. What is the OSF and what can you do with it? So first things first, create a free account if you haven't. For every individual, the OSF will always be free. You can either sign up through ORCID, you can sign up using single sign-on through an institution if your institution is a member, or you can just create an account, an unaffiliated account. Anyone can start an OSF account for free. And the tools that I'll be talking about are kind of paid services primarily for administrators, both at universities, libraries, but also at small research groups within a research group within an institution. There's lots of different iterations of how our paid products are used. And there are three primary things that you can do on the OSF. You can work in a project space, you can create a registration and work in a registration space, or you can create and work in a preprint space. Some of these workflows are more familiar to some of you, some of them may be less familiar. I'll hopefully give you enough of an overview that you will understand how the products link in with these workflows moving forward. So, what are projects on the OSF? Historically, projects have been a place for teams to show ideas, to refine ideas, to work collaboratively together. They're centralized workspaces where data, materials, and information about a project can be organized and shared in one space. So you can upload and version files. You have an activity log that tracks when changes are made and by whom. At the moment, projects can be private or public, although I will say that in general on the OSF, we're moving towards um, pushing all material to be public, which makes sense because it's aligned with our overall mission for transparency and openness in scholarship. But at the moment, you can have some data and files private within projects. One of the nice things about projects is you can have a structure within your project of subcomponents, for example, that meets your needs for access. So some collaborators or contributors, for example, can have access to some components and not others, or you can make privacy or licensing, for example, different on different types of components. You can also add and remove collaborators at any time. And if a project is public, you can mint a DOI for that project. So a lot of institutions and organizations like using the OSF because of the flexibility of the project space. And I would imagine many of you who already have OSF accounts may have already dabbled in using or sharing or publishing a project on the OSF. And then just a couple of other powerful features that you might not be aware of, some of which are specific to projects, but also some of these are relevant for other workflows on the OSF. You can, as I said, set fine-grained permissions on nodes or components of OSF projects. You can utilize, and we encourage utilization of our metadata schema and persistent identifiers within the project space. So things like ROR identifiers, ORCID IDs, funder identifiers, DOIs, etc. You can also utilize our API to propagate data from projects as well as registrations and preprints, as well as metadata from those objects in different ways if you do have the technical capacity to do that. And so how does this differ from a registration on the OSF, which is a different object? The primary difference is that a registration is a permanent time-stamped object on the OSF. And one of the primary ways that registrations are used on the OSF is something called pre-registration, which separates kind of the exploratory from the confirmatory part of research. Often pre-registration says, it has a study plan, says what research project or group is going to do before it is done. And then the updates to that registration include, the results and outputs from that study plan. You may be familiar with the registration if you work in specific disciplines. If you do or touch clinical or health research in any way, you're likely aware of clinicaltrials.gov, which is one of the larger registries. The OSF operates as a generalist registry, so you can publish a registration on the OSF, or you can submit your registration to a community-operated registry, which is what I'll be talking about a little bit today. It's an OSF registry. And on the OSF, we have a number of different registration templates that you can use. Some of them have been community developed within different disciplines. Some of them are more general. Some of them are specific to specific types or formats of research. And if you're interested in learning more about registrations, registration templates, and different types of registrations on the OSF. We just had a webinar a few weeks ago about pre-registrations in the format of scoping and systematic reviews on the OSF. And I don't have the link handy, but one of my colleagues can drop the link to that webinar in the chat so you can have a watch at that. I think it was quite helpful. And registrations, just to emphasize the difference between projects and registrations are permanent, so they cannot be deleted. from the OSF. It's a permanent registration of your research study plan, and there's a limited number of updates to registration, and the way that they look on the OSF is different. The updates to registration are limited to 4, and you're also limited in terms of your privacy settings on registration, obviously, because as a permanent object, it must be public, but you can embargo the registration for up to 4 years. So if you don't want to get scooped, but you want to make sure you have your flag in the ground for when you began the study plan and embarked on the research, you can do that before you make it public. And a DOI is affiliated with that registration when it is made public. Some features of OSF registrations that are specific to the OSF platform are that you can make registrations in 2 ways on the OSF. One way is to create it from scratch, and the other is to create it from an existing OSF project. And both of these ways of creating a registration on the OSF have, plus and minus, downsides and upsides. If you have already been working within a project space, sometimes for many years, for example, and you want to make sure you're taking files, documents, metadata, and data from that project and porting them into the registration, it's easier to create it from that existing OSF project. But sometimes that's actually the downside. You have too much material and too much information, and you actually, it's better to start the registration from scratch with a pre-existing empty template. So there's lots of different ways to go about this and lots of different examples of this, both in our help guides, which Gretchen or Teresa can drop, as well as in the webinar that we ran last week. And in general, I'll say that for the rest of the year, we're going to be running webinars on a monthly basis that talk about some specific workflows and aspects of the OSF that are very relevant to what I'm talking about today. So I highly recommend registering for those webinars. Gretchen has run one on metadata on the OSF. I've run one on scoping and systematic reviews. We have some coming up in the coming months that sort of tackle a lot of different frequently asked questions about how registrations and different workflows on the OSF function. So recommend checking those out. So OSF institutions work in kind of collaboration with or sits on top of the way that OSF registrations and projects as well as preprints function on the OSF. So the OSF institutional membership, if you're confused, is a paid service. Institutional membership there needs to be a sort of opt-in framework from that institution in order for the institution to show up as a institutional login on the OSF. So if you've looked and have been unable to find your institution when you sign up to the OSF, it's because your institution is not a member. Membership allows for that institution to create a kind of auto affiliation of all the affiliated users' material on the OSF. So an institutional single sign-on login will be created for that institution, and that allows for us to affiliate the public material that users who use that login have published or will publish on the OSF. And then all of these projects, registrations, and preprints that are affiliated with your institution, for example, will then be automatically aggregated on an institutional page. It also, as part of that affiliation, it's adding a ROR institutional identifier to metadata that's associated with those projects and registrations, and then it gets shared downstream in places like DataCite and ORCID, so you can easily find all of that material. The kind of TLDR on what OSF institutions does for an institution is it helps make the material that already exists on the OSF and that will exist on the OSF more fair. And so not only do like projects and registrations and preprints show up on the institutional landing page, you also have institutional branding on all of those projects, preprints, and registrations, and anyone who visits them can see that affiliation. Conversely, also on the admin backend, you can also remove that affiliation, both as an individual user, if you have a project, for example, that you don't want affiliated with an institution, but As a librarian, for example, we have a kind of data curation like role, which allows you to engage with individual users from your institution and say, hey, we should rethink this affiliation, or, as part of compliance with your, funder, this we need to make some of these changes. So there's a way to engage with users on the back end. One of the things that Gretchen does and really helps with significantly is thinking through how to, provide, like, create support materials, communication for your research community to make the process of becoming an institutional member seamless. So she helps provide material, resources, onboarding, like a 1 hour webinar kind of training for folks that can help guide your research community to use the OSF in ways that you feel are helpful. And every institution, unfortunately for us, unfortunately for every institution, everyone has their own goals in using the OSF. The OSF often sits alongside a lot of other repository tools and database tools. And when we work with you, when Gretchen works with you to onboard your institution, she helps you think through what some of those goals are so that she can integrate that into your onboarding process and your ongoing communication process. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in terms of reporting that we provide for you as an institutional member. But just right here on the page, you can see on the left, here's East Carolina University's OSF institutions page. You can see an example also from ECU of how they talk about the OSF and some of the institutional libguides that they use to help their researchers onboard to the OSF platform. And one other thing that, Gretchen, you might want to just drop in the chat right now, if you can find it before the end of the webinar, is our LibGuide kind of reference sheet, which shows you really the vast range of ways in which institutional members talk about the OSF to their research community as a tool. So in the same way that OSF institutions aggregates material under a branded page, in that case, it's done automatically via single sign-on. OSF Registries also aggregates material under one branded page, but it does it in terms of a moderated and submission moderated and mediated, curated fashion. So with OSF Registries, you can stand up. I'm sorry, I can't fix this now, but it's a squished image. But in OSF Registries, like this one you can see here from Stiftelsendam, and if Gretchen, you can drop a link into that registry so folks can see that. This is a Norwegian funding agency that uses a registry for all of their funded research. So every researcher that applies for funding through this organization has to use a registration template that they've developed with us that they require, and researchers will then submit that registration to the OSF registry. This is really important for them. They want a flagship kind of location where they can point to all their funded research through registrations, and they also want their research outputs that they fund to be as rigorous as possible. And so they use a registry to do so. And I'll say, as some background, if you're not familiar with registrations, again, you may be, depending on what discipline or field you are working within. Research, meta-science research from our own research team, and from within the field of open scholarship points to open practices that are required as part of registration as driving towards more rigorous research outputs. So things like sharing a study plan before data is collected or analyzed, sharing research outputs like data, like code libraries, like research outputs like papers, sharing these openly and in a fair fashion, so in a findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible way, can lead to more rigorous research outcomes. So the entire kind of policy framework of a lot of organizations that stand up OSF registries is that they want to support more rigorous research outputs, i.e., better scholarship through the requirement of an OSF registry. So that's why we point to and support the infrastructure behind a community operated registry, like, for example, Stiftelse Dom's registry. One of the things you get with an OSF registry, which again is a paid service, is that you have an administrative backend where you can moderate submissions. You can also work with us to create custom registration templates. And the affiliated, any submission that's accepted into a registry is given an affiliate indicator, so you can see that it's a part of that registry. OSF preprints operate very similarly in a similar fashion to OSF registries. I will note that recently, within the past 6 months, there's been a change on the OSF, so we no longer support. We are no longer a generalist preprint service, so you can't. If you're just a person in the world, you can't just submit any old PDF to the OSF as a preprint repository. You must submit it to one of our community operated preprint services. And you too can also stand up a preprint service on the OSF. So you also get a branded landing page, you have submission control and templates. Pricing for OSF preprints is tiered. So if you're only looking at, under 100 preprint submissions a year, it's cheaper than having a much larger preprint submission tier. And that's really dependent on what your community and policies are. And again, you can have affiliation. So any preprint that's accepted into your preprint service will then have your service affiliated with that preprint, and therefore also searchable within the OSF search via that metadata. One of the reasons, taking a step back again, why the OSF is a powerful tool is because of the interoperability with a lot of different storage and citation tools. So if you're already using a lot of other tools, you can also connect those with your OSF projects, registries, and to a certain extent preprints. And we're working all the time to extend this network of integrations to make the OSF not a replacement for tools that you're already using, but a way to, excuse me, a way to find files and data that you might be storing in other locations, and to make sure, again, that it's still fair and affiliated with things like registrations on the OSF. And I'll just show here, this is a kind of way within a project to add additional storage to a project, again, through these integrations with some other storage providers like Dropbox or Box, or even GitHub, for example. I think OSF currently can integrate with about 10 or 11 storage providers, and we have 2 citation managers that we can also integrate with, and we're working to make the addition of more of these integrated services easier. If you have questions about that, Gretchen can also answer those in the Q&A. The OpenOSF API does allow for the development of these types of integrations by anybody. We have some history of doing that, and again, Gretchen can answer questions about that if you have that in the Q&A right now. Just as a use case, looking at, for example, the University of British Columbia, which is one of our institutional members. So you can see here on a project level at the upper left what an affiliation looks like on a public project. So you have a project DOI, you have the affiliation image from that institution. You can see also a example of a affiliated preprint from that institution that was submitted to SciArchive, and you can see actually this particular preprint has 2 affiliated institutions because at least 2 of the authors come from affiliated institutions. And we'll send these slides through to you, and you can click through and see how the data from this ROR affiliation, you can also find, because the DataCite Commons page, the UBC DataCite Commons page, contains all of this affiliated material, projects, registrations, and preprints. So one of the great things about signing up for an institutional membership is that you get access to a back-end administrative dashboard that we actually built in collaboration with a lot of our existing members to understand what exactly was, important for them to see live, pulled from our API in a dashboard format. And you can see an example of just some of the basic information that's provided in that admin dashboard to the left there, things like total users, logged in users, active users, total storage on the OSF, total public file count, the total number of preprints. And you can download and slice and dice and filter this information from within the admin dashboard as an OSF institutional member. You can also add as many institutional admins as you'd like to your backend so that they can access this data. We also, Gretchen will work with you to think through quarterly reporting and the data that is relevant to you. So here you can see more longitudinal data, what's changed from when, for example, you started your institutional membership to the current date, and even to a certain extent, some of the goals you may have, and whether or not we've been able to sort of help you get there through the utilization of the platform. You can see things like total page views, very popular project or registration or preprint pages, whether or not you have a lot of private material on the platform or embargoed material, which might be a sign of how folks might be using the OSF more as a collaboration tool versus more of a data sharing or publishing tool. So all of this is included in OSF institutional membership in your annual fee for the service. I'll also say that we have a lot of institutions that have been with us for, almost a decade now. And we know that there are best practices in terms of standing up an instance of OSF institutions. Virginia Commonwealth University VCU is a really great example of this, as they have really leveraged the OSF alongside a lot of other tools. They have, for many years, required the use of OSF for a data science lab and some affiliated classes within their medical school. So they've ensured that the OSF has been used in a way that is aligned with their needs and with their requirements for researchers at the institution. And they've worked with us even to take some of our training resources, which are always open source and you can find them on the OSF. And they've actually leveraged those and used those to create their own training and use them within courses that they offer. So they offer their own OSF workshops, essentially. Happy to talk more about that. And we've done a lot of collaborative work with VCU to share some of the things that they found have worked within both their graduate community, but also amongst their PIs and other researchers. So just as an overview, membership for OSF institutions, and to a certain extent for registries as well, includes a branded page. For institutions, includes a single sign-on and auto-affiliation of public material. For all of our services, you get help desk prioritization. Gretchen is your dedicated member service manager. And in addition to the help desk, you also have a demo and onboarding for staff or students or researchers, whatever audience you think might need it. You also get an admin metrics dashboard for OSF institutions. You also have a backend admin dashboard for other services. You get quarterly longitudinal metrics reports, and you also have access to things like working groups and the ability to provide feedback on feature development, which has been really powerful for some of our members over the years. And you have a 25% discount on group training for staff, students, and researchers. So if you find that onboarding is one thing, but you actually really need to do more training around, for example, data sharing or reproducible methods, Crystal Steltenpole, who runs our training services at COS, runs group workshops that you can kind of mix and match content for, and offer those to whatever audience you see fit. And that 25% training is great because, as again, it helps. 25% off on training is great because it can help do the types of things that are difficult to do online and that are easier to do in a workshop format. So answering a lot of the different questions about like how the OSF can help in your ultimate goal or aims around open scholarship practices or behaviors at your institution. That's kind of why we built the training and why we find it powerful. And I'll say that we also just launched self-paced training for individuals. So we'll be launching a new module of this every month for the rest of the year. And this is because group training doesn't always work or function for larger groups or for an institution that really just wants to offer something for folks to do on their own. So this we leverage a LMS for this called Canvas. You can take courses on your own time, finish them within 6 months. You can get a series of open badges to demonstrate your knowledge. We have two courses that are available right now: Fundamentals of Open Scholarship and Pre-Registration and Registered Reports. There's a data management and sharing module or course that's dropping in June. For those of you that are here in this webinar, super excited that you're here because I can give you this 50% off discount. And if you buy a course within the next month. If you are interested in offering this self-paced course to many people within your institutional context, just feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about what that looks like. But this is brand new. We've just launched it in the past couple months, so highly recommend taking a look at that. And again, that discount code is OSF May. We'll send that to you in an email if you are here in the webinar. Some membership benefits, again, to look at it in a different way, because sometimes it can be confusing to understand what's the difference between being a free user on the OSF, which all of you can be right now, and many of you probably are, versus a paid kind of membership for one of our services, is pretty much the difference between things like single sign-on, the auto affiliation, or for example, curation and moderation. Those are not available for free accounts. So you can't curate and collect and aggregate a number of projects or registrations or preprints without having a paid membership. And things like customized training or onboarding for a group of people, that's all part of what happens with a paid membership. Things like dashboards, usage reports, and metrics are also part of paid membership. So I'll say that for OSF institutions, our annual service pricing is $4,999. We have the same pricing for both registries and collections, which is $5,000 a year. And preprints are tiered, as I mentioned before, so they're priced starting from $999 per year. If you have questions about pricing or things like what the cost of add-on features like training, group training, for example, additional storage, custom domains, you can visit our website. You can also shoot me or Gretchen an email. And I will leave these emails up as I now look to the chat to see if we have any questions, which for some reason I can't find. Oh, no, okay, no questions at all. If you do have questions and you don't want to ask them here, feel free to shoot us an email. You can also reply to the follow-up email that Teresa will send out to you with the recording of this webinar, as well as a bunch of the links that we've talked about today. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and please make sure to sign up for some of our other webinars coming up in the next months.